My name is Tori, and I'll be your host this evening. We're delighted to welcome Amy Siskind and Walter Shaub here tonight to discuss the list. Please silence your cell phones, but don't turn them off because we'd love to see your post of tonight's event on social media. Be sure to tag us if you do at P&P Wharf. For more information on upcoming events at the Wharf, please pick up an events brochure at the register or visit our website, politics-prose.com/Wharf. We will also have a Q&A period at the end where we'll invite you in the audience to ask questions. Amy will then be signing copies of the book up here, and if you haven't already purchased a book, there are copies for sale at the register. Now for the main event. Experts in authoritarianism advise to keep a list of things subtly changing around you so you'll remember. Siskind, president and co-founder of the New Agenda, took this advice to heart, and when Trump took office, she began cataloging his administration's threats to democratic institutions, migrants, the environment, and more. Originally shared with friends, the weekly list soon went viral, and each new edition now gets more than 500,000 viewers. The bound edition is a comprehensive accounting of Trump's first year, starting with his embrace of white supremacists in his first week, and tallying both the major scandals and tweet storms, as well as the smaller, seemingly minor, but gravely important outrages against ethics, rights, and common decency. Siskind is joined tonight by Walter Shaub, former director of the United States Office of Government Ethics. Please join me in welcoming them here to the Wharf.
And this is kind of neat for me because Walter is like a main character in my book. I was just telling him I remember where I was that summer day. I was in Provincetown trying to take a few days off the week he resigned. We're all conflicted. Do we want good people to leave or stay? But anyway, thank you so much for being here. This is all like a surreal experience for me, this whole journey. Starting with making the list, which when I started, there were no grand ambitions. It was just a sense towards the end of the election and then the shock of the election that something was not right. And following, if you remember, trip down memory lane, the very first days after the election, the legitimization of hate and the acts of hate around our country, what was happening to school children, what was happening on our campuses, what was happening in our cities and everywhere in the country. And the Southern Poverty Law Center in the first week had, I think, 400 attacks, and I could have named most of them because they were being covered in the media. As the first 10 days came to a close, I stopped being able to keep track, and there were 700. And it was that, and then the attacks on our media. The day I started the list, he was attacking the New York Times, SNL, and the cast of Hamilton. Remember that Saturday? And I had been reading articles about authoritarianism because I was concerned that, unlike Republicans or Democrats, he didn't have any policies, he didn't have any vision. He seemed to be playing on fears and the worst of us, so I started reading about authoritarianism. And that Saturday, the Hamilton Day, I decided to drive up to Eleanor Roosevelt's home, Valkill, and Eleanor's kind of my North Star for sort of spiritual guidance, and it's a place I go frequently. And just reading her quotes about government and our democracy is we the people, and we are in charge of our government. And the fact that she wrote things down, that night I went home, and it was strange. There was a tweet, and it's in the first week, from a reporter from the New York Times criticizing his own paper for their coverage of Trump, and then it disappeared. And I was like, wow. So that night I started to write the list, and the first list went up that Sunday, November 13th, and it was 9 items. And the last few weeks have been around 150 items, and it kind of went like this. So when people ask me, do you think it was a good idea to do the list, I sort of circle the early weeks. I'm like, this is when I thought it was a good idea to do the list. Because obviously my personal life now has been dramatically changed. In the initial weeks, it was 8 items a week, and then 18 items, and then it skipped into the 20s. When he took office, it was around 30-something items around the time of the Women's March. And as he staffed up the regime, and there were many hands doing the work of deconstructing our democracy, the number of items just started to skyrocket, and towards the end of the book you have in your hands, it was steadily around 120 items. And I think myself and probably many people in this room thought when he first won the election, whether that's legitimate or not, I think we can talk about that as well, there's a lot of stuff in the book about that that has yet to be covered properly. There was a sense that it wouldn't last, that there would be accountability and he would be gone. And I felt like by the summer, with all the things he had done, I was just reminded on a radio show this morning I did with NPR that Obama went through 8 years without a single scandal. And here we have, oh, it's Tuesday, there's 5 more. You know, every day, you know, and it's not just him, it's everyone surrounded by him. This week it's Pruitt, last week, I mean, it's every week it's a different cast of characters. But what they've gotten away with and continue to get away with, I thought there would be accountability. And I think my biggest lesson I've taken away from this is what we learned in high school history is we thought there were checks and balances, but a lot of what we counted on were really norms, not laws. And hopefully there'll be some changes to that after this comes about. So I guess Walter's gonna ask me some questions, and then I'd love to hear your questions at the end.
Good. Well, as one of the characters in your book, and if I thought you had really written our reality, I'd resent you deeply, but I think you were just cataloging our reality, and it's not your blame. And the list, you know, what a title. That sounds like a thriller, except sadly it is. And sadly it's really, really thick, because this stuff is just coming at us. So early on, she just read a minute ago to you that line that explains what you're doing here, and I'll read it again. Experts in authoritarianism advise to keep a list of things subtly changing around you so you'll remember.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good, okay. So, and I have to try to ask this question with a straight face. So why authoritarianism? And more importantly though, why do we need to remember? What do you hope the list will help us achieve?
So the experts that I read about warned that things, and people now say to me, well, why are you comparing him to Hitler? Like, it was so much worse then. Well, Hitler didn't all of a sudden in 1 year transform Germany. This was like a gradual process. Or if you look at the authoritarian figures around the world in the past. And that's what that's what really stood out to me reading what the experts were saying, that it would be a slow, gradual process. It was Masha Gessen who said, don't be fooled by small gestures that seem normal when the rest of everything around you is not. And it was really Sarah who wrote the foreword for the book appropriately, whose article I read that was really, it just stuck with me, that you have to write down what life is like today, because you're gonna look back at your notes and not believe what has happened. And so it was really on her advice. Shortly after I wrote it, one of my college professors sent me an email. She had seen my list at this point. It was just a few weeks in. And it was her comparison of we're like a frog in water, being brought to boil degree by degree. And that's what was happening. And I could see it once I was starting to do it.
Yeah, looking through the book, reading it reminded me of a number of things I'd already forgotten about. And today I just stumbled across, coincidentally, the story early on in November 2016 where Ivanka Trump accompanied him to a meeting with a Japanese premier. And I remembered how angry I was at the time. And I realized now it's like that seems like nothing compared to everything that's happened since. So I could see the danger of forgetting if we're ever going to put things back the way they were.
Right.
And along those same lines, another question I have for you has to do with the fact that, as we've said tonight, things seem like they're coming at us through a fire hose. There's just one story after another. And I've personally had the experience of pitching reporters on stories that I thought were really big and in any other administration would be front page news. And I thought, this is horrible. There has to be some accountability. And I've struggled to even get them to report it on like page 837 because they're drowned out by everything else. So I guess the question I have for you is, what's the danger if people can become desensitized to the news when it's coming at us so fast?
So there's sort of a dichotomy. Trump hasn't changed since the time I started the book. In the first week, he was criticizing SNL. 3 weeks ago, he was still criticizing SNL. In the first week, he was asking us, when there were all these acts of hate, he wouldn't condemn them, he was asking us for understanding of others. and we had Charlottesville, and he was still asking for understanding of others, and today we're talking about caravans. So he hasn't changed, but our country has changed, and I think it's a lot of exactly what you're referring to. There's no accountability. Like, I mean, you mentioned Ivanka. We had 2 weeks ago, well, 2 weeks ago he went, Donald Jr. went to India to give a speech on behalf of the US, and then in this week's list you're gonna find they were having problems with a Trump property in Mumbai, and so he needed to go there for, you know, to pay somebody off or do whatever he was doing to exert the US force to have things work out for them. And that will be one item this week in 150 or 160. And I think what's happened is our media tends to focus on about 20% of the items in each week. And the other 80% either get single coverage, they're local stories, or there's just so much volume, the other stories just don't get any coverage. And there can be 5 stories in a day that in normal times, like your Ivanka story, would be front page of the Washington Post for a month and top of the hour on CNN for, you know, weeks. And now it's, you know, that's today, and then tomorrow there'll be 5 more. So that's why having this trail back is so important for us.
Just when you mentioned that India trip, I was thinking that was a couple months ago, and it's a couple weeks ago.
It is a couple
Time is
weeks
moving
ago.
differently at the pace of events.
Yes.
The foreword of your book was written by one of the experts on authoritarianism. You cite Sarah Kendzior.
Mm-hmm.
And in her foreword, she writes, there's a difference between expecting authoritarian, she says, expecting autocracy and accepting it. So is that part of the point of the list, and what does it mean to expect autocracy but not accept it?
Well, I'm still shocked by the number of people that feel like this is no big deal. I just did an interview at NPR that some of you might have heard today with somebody who was interviewing me saying, this is just like any other president. There's still a lot of disbelief out there. And I think what Sarah warned, and in the early days in November 2016, when Sarah was speaking out, when I was speaking out, people were calling us hysterical, that you know, this was just, you know, he would get used to it, he would fit into patterns. He never did, nor will he ever. He doesn't have, you know, he never had traditional policies, goals in mind for where he was taking the country. It was always about 2 things, enriching himself and staying in power. And we're at a dangerous stage now in the last few weeks. We can talk about that. And he's sort of transitioned to a new phase. But I think what Sarah warned, there would be 2 ways our country could go. And starting with the Women's March, which then repeated, and we had 1 million people march a second time. We could have been like the Naomi Schulman poem and been like the nice people, watching first the immigrants be, you know, marched out by ICE, and then having them go after Muslim Americans and the Black Americans and Jews. I mean, who knows what order? We're all getting our due. But our country has woken, and I have so many people I know in my community, from my college friends, from my high school friends, who are never politically involved, who are involved now. So I don't think this is democracy versus Republican, Republican versus Democrat. I think this is people fighting for our democracy and our values. And I think that's what you're seeing now.
I think you're really right about the idea that there are people who are downplaying it. And I find that to be true sometimes of some in the media, where they're afraid to look like they've gone too far, and so they rein it in, or others who I think are legitimate or genuinely dismissive of reaction. But
Yep.
I think you're right that not accepting it is very different than expecting it. And I think that intensity is important, because I also think we've shifted into a new phase recently.
Yes.
And along those lines, Sarah in her foreword says again, Trump does not appear to recognize the branches of government as separate administrative organs designed to serve the people, but instead sees them as mechanisms of personal power. And I think that applies across the branches, but also internal to the executive branch. In chronicling the events of the Trump era, have you found that to be the case too?
Yeah, so one thing I harp on, the Washington Post pointed this out in their review, I'm kind of relentless on the unstaffed key roles in the executive branch, which are still a third of key roles are unfilled, not only unfilled, but they have no nominees. So that was alarming, and that hasn't really progressed. But what's even more alarming to me is he's lost roughly half of the other senior roles in his White House. And now he's of the mindset, and this is true authoritarianism, he doesn't have to replace them. It's unclear if he's going to replace his communications director because he's the best one at it. He might fire Kelly and be his own chief of staff. And he's entered a phase that, there's a lot of weeks here where he's lost the narrative, he's angry, he's stormy. He's not anymore. He's confident now. He's assumed power. He's acting unilaterally since week 67, we're on week 73. The policies that he's putting forward now are, he spoke to someone whose real estate malls aren't doing well, so let's go after Bezos and Amazon. Or last week, let's impose tariffs on China. Who knows why? Maybe they won't give him something he wanted for his personal businesses. I'm sure it has nothing to do with China. Or to change the subject, or the week before, meeting with South Korean officials, and before they could even finish, saying, no, I'll do it, and sending them out to tell our country that he was going to meet with Kim Jong-un, which seems great because we have no State Department, so he doesn't really need to be briefed or anything. Why would, he need to know anything? Literally, like 8 of the 10 top roles in our State Department are unfilled. And of the 2 that are filled, one is a Fox and Friends co-host. Mm-hmm. So you literally can't make this up. I mean, he hired a CNBC host. He hired now somebody from Disney to be his assistant communications director. So, yeah, he's basically now running the show. The executive branches, the people he has brought in are basically deconstructing the agencies they run.
It's interesting, too, because there's a few examples where he's discovered the hard way that when you put somebody in a position, they don't always do every last thing you want. And so he's clashed with the head of the FBI, he's clashed with Jeff Sessions, his own Office of Special Counsel, which is not Mueller, it's the office that investigates Hatch Act violations, did an investigation and found Kellyanne Conway violated it twice. Well, 6 months ago, they said this guy walked on water when they brought him in from an outside conservative group and tried to get the Senate to confirm him. And it turns out he actually is a serious guy who intended to do his job. He's one of the few really good appointees they've had. Well, now they have no use for him because he actually wanted to do his job. And so I can see how there might be this preference to leave jobs open in order to have more control. So along those lines, how do you feel like the checks and balances are working out? And where do you see the particular pressure points?
Yeah, so we've talked about our executive branch, or what remains of it. Again, the agencies that are filled, when you look at the actions they're taking, which are heavily documented in my book, they're basically deconstructing their agencies from within. I mean, classic example, when the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, when the acting chief left, this was the first example of a Trump nominee in the judicial branch having say. And then Mulvaney became the interim leader. What did he do? He asked for a budget of 0. So what better way to deconstruct an agency than to take away its funding? So, that's pretty widespread. The legislative branch, in the early weeks of the list, I really like the time that Graham and McCain and Amy Klobuchar went abroad to try to reassure our allies that it was going to be okay, despite the fact that in the early weeks Trump said he wasn't sure if we should stay in NATO. I had these hopes, and you see some of these characters transform themselves, like Graham, big question mark. What happened to Lindsey Graham in this book? Yeah, he started out a certain way, and look at, now he's, gone a complete 180. So he has, through whatever devices, maybe through bullying, maybe through compromising information, I don't know, because they're outside of the tax bill, they're not getting anything out of it. He's stymied the Republican Party, and I think that's probably my biggest disappointment in this whole thing, is that I thought anybody who was an elected official would put country first, and they haven't. And, the Democrats, and I've said this, I'm from New York, I love Chuck Schumer, he's a great senator, I would vote for him again, but we need a wartime conciliation in the House and the Senate. You should never have passed the budget without DACA being part of it. They are laying over, I can't believe how quiet both parties are in the face of this man basically assuming control. So the only thing that's saving us week after week in this list is the judicial branch, which he now is heavily, I think it was last week's list, he said, oh, Obama did such a terrible job getting people in the judicial branch. Ask McConnell about that. But he filled all those roles, and they've taken away norms like the blue slip and what we did with Gorsuch to make that easier. But the judicial branch has stopped DACA, has stopped the Muslim ban, recreated a travel ban, which is really the Muslim ban several times. The ACLU won a big victory this week for them trying to block undocumented teens from having abortions. So it's really been our judicial branch that has put any sort of checks and balances in place.
Along those lines, in terms of the one remaining branch that's standing, there's an interesting interview with Don McGahn, counsel to the president who runs the vetting operation for these guys. And he tells in the article about how he had them create two lists, really talented, really well-recognized conservatives who would definitely pass vetting and get confirmed, and a list of people who will make people nervous. And then when they created two lists, he says, let's throw out the traditional list and only go with the one that will make people nervous. And so for all of the sort of buffoonery we see in a lot of areas, that's one area that they've been exceedingly successful in. And as you say, partly because McConnell cleared the path for that by refusing to confirm. So you mentioned I'm a character in your book, and I have to admit I'm honored to have been noticed, but I'm more horrified that there was anything to notice, because in an ideal situation, ethics is going well, and you don't hear about it at all. I wonder if you could read a couple of my favorite items from pages 20 and 20 and 21. And I can either give you the book or I printed them out, but mine might have typos. So. And it's pages 20 and 21. You can just focus on the ones heavily affecting OGE.
Okay.
But I jotted down 1, 2, 3, 8, 12.
Okay, number 1, the Office of Government Ethics, OGE, Director, publicly lamented, quote, we seem to have lost contact with the Trump-Pence transition since the election. Number 2 was 3 vendors have placed liens on the Trump International Hotel in DC for unpaid bills of over $5 million. Number 3, the OGE said they had not completed ethics reviews of Trump's cabinet nominees. Senator McConnell said the Democrats need to, quote, grow up and not delay confirmations. What other number?
How about,
oh, there's more. Number 18. The director of the OGE publicly blasted Trump's non-plan for dealing with conflicts of interest. The next day, Representative Jason Chaffetz threatened to investigate the OGE.
Oh, I didn't see that one. Yeah, that was yeah. And then there was, at the press conference, Trump said he had no plans to release his tax returns or resolve conflicts of interest, saying, I have no conflict situation because I'm the president. It's just stunning. All right, so what criteria do you use to decide what goes in the list? Are you focusing on policy issues, things that distinguish one party from another, or more systemic issues?
So nothing to do with Democrat versus Republican, which in the early days was very confusing to people because they would be really upset. You didn't talk about what the Republicans did with trying to repeal Obamacare. The stuff I would report is the people with disabilities outside McConnell's office who were handcuffed, taken out of their wheelchairs, and dragged out. That's not normal. You know, Republicans and Democrats disagreeing on policy is normal. So everything in here, it has to do with breaking of norms, whether it be, you know, if we're talking legislatively, getting rid of blue slip waivers for judicial nominees, if we're talking about ICE rounding up people from 7-Elevens around the country, rights being taken away from marginalized communities, information disappearing. That was one of the first things that happened. That's a hallmark of authoritarianism. in the early weeks, information started to disappear, and that continues as recently as yesterday when information on breast cancer got taken down. But there's been a sort of overall theme, if I were to put it in words, that, and I don't know if this is a strategy of how they do it, but first you make things invisible. So if climate change doesn't exist, or if the LGBT community doesn't exist, like in the census, or if immigrants don't exist, then they don't need rights. And so that's what they do. They make you invisible, they take stuff off the website, and then when Sessions says, well, the 1964 law, when we say we're going back like half a century, we're really going back half a century. Civil Rights Act did not cover sexual orientation. I mean, it's all part of the same plan of taking away rights from marginalized communities, but that all starts with taking away information, which was an impetus for doing this list, and also an impetus for them putting it in print, because people like Sarah were like, and it seems extreme at the time, but then they repealed net neutrality. That was like the last, decision point for me in wanting to have it in a book form, that people wouldn't be able to actually read it if it were online for some people.
That's chilling. So given the volume of news coming at us, how much time does it take? Is it
yeah. Again, those early weeks circled is when I thought it was a good idea. So I've become a lot more efficient at it. And I have to read everything, and then I have to determine, is this normal? And a lot of times people will send me stuff, or I'll see something, and then I'll research it, and I'll find out Obama had done something similar, or Reagan had done something similar. So if it's normal, I don't put it in the list. But at this point, I'd say it's somewhere between 30 and 35 hours a week, because he keeps, and I spend, I think I drive my publisher crazy, or vice versa, because I really need, it's hard for me to travel. I probably will have to go back to my hotel tonight and work on the list. I basically work on it every night, and then pretty much all of Friday till midnight or 1. I wake up, take the dogs to the trail, and then have to work on it to try to have it make sense. So when you read it, it's ordered. And I'll give you an example. It's all factual information. There's no opinions. I wanted it to just be purely facts-based. But 3 weeks ago, and this is stuff I'm sure everybody missed in the chaos, Trump had a really bad call with the president of Mexico, who was supposed to come to the White House, who still hasn't been to the White House. It was turned into a screaming match, and the visit was canceled. That Thursday, the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, who had been in the State Department for decades and one of the foremost experts in that area, resigned. So, for example, I put those two items together. I didn't say she resigned because of that. You can draw your own conclusions of why she resigned that week. But I do try to also put items relating to marginalized communities and ethics up near the top, because they get very little coverage. Our media tends to focus on the same stories during the week. And again, those are probably, in the scheme of things, 20% of the stories in the list.
Yeah, that's great. Well, yay for ethics. Thanks for putting that.
There's always a lot. Like Pruitt was a frequent flyer. Last week, looks like he'll be doing that again this week. And Zink, these guys, you can't make it up. It just.
So will you continue cataloging these unprecedented things? Sounds like you're still doing it.
I'm going to keep going until he's gone.
Yeah. And then lastly, you touched on this already, but what does it mean for you to see this in a book now?
I'm still getting used to that it's actual history. I compare myself to the character Carrie in Homeland, because I see things from this book, and you hopefully will start to see things too as you read it, like patterns, and I'm screaming inside my head, like Sinclair Broadcasting. The first event I did for this book was I keynoted the ACLU event about a week and a half ago, and I spoke about Sinclair Broadcasting and all the other media plays that have been impacted, but this stuff doesn't get covered until suddenly something comes to the top, and then they all cover it, and then by next week you'll forget about Sinclair Broadcasting.
Never.
When I made the Politico 50 last year, and they asked me what story is not being covered, Cambridge Analytica. And you're going to read in this book, there's 1 week alone in the summer. I remember I was taking my son on college tours, and I was sitting in the hotel that night trying to keep up. there's so many things that indicate we might not have had a fair election. And Cambridge Analytica is pretty heavy in this book, but then there's all these other examples of, for example, in North Carolina, the day of voting, that there were problems with voter rolls in blue districts, but the red ones next door had no problems. Deep Root Analytics, which was an RNC vendor, left voting information on 200 million voters, including their names, their addresses, their emails, their voter affiliation, exposed online for weeks. And then the head of that eventually became part of the Trump regime. Surprise, surprise. But those are the kind of things that like are shocking in the week, and then it's Tuesday, and there's 10 more shocking things that we've forgotten. So I hope when stuff comes out now, like Cambridge Analytica or Sinclair Broadcasting, you can like look in the table of contents and remember the stuff that's already happened. Because this stuff is not new, it's just the media finally has time to cover it.
I think this book is going to prove really useful to historians in the future as people try to understand it, assuming that there are historians or books.
That's what Sarah says. And at the time, you laugh, but then it becomes less funny. Yeah, but net neutrality was kind of a shocker to me. Like Sarah would have predicted that, and it happened. And there's a lot of media that's been shuttered. So, love to. So, should we take some questions?
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you for writing the book. And I'm curious, who do you read, and who do you listen to stay tuned in? There's so many sources.
Yeah, so I'm pretty strict with the sources I use in the book. And there's 100 pages of triple column footnotes, so everything is sourced in the book. I only use like well-known, well-regarded, like the Washington Post is #1, Politico, New York Times, CNN, NBC News, ABC News. And then a lot of the stories are only picked up locally. For example, when I started to look at Motel 6, they were giving names to ICE. And it happened first in Phoenix, and I noticed this because the Phoenix Times tweeted at me. And so I picked up the story and I tweeted it, and then Motel 6 apologized, and then like 3 or 4 weeks later, they started doing it around the country. And then it became a bigger thing, people started boycotting them, and it stopped. So in answer to your question, I look at Twitter, and that's why I'm sorry I don't follow everyone back. I try to just follow like actual news stories and or reporters that are really relevant, and I switch up depending on what story topics are in. I really, so that way I feel like I see everything. It's pretty rare that I go through a week and I miss something, and if I do, I just add it in to the next week. But somehow my methodology, and I'm a little bit of a nerd like Walter, I just don't like, I only took like English 101. I started off as a math major. I ended up doing economics because more cool people were in economics. But I minored in math and computer science. So I'm pretty nerdy, and I tried to be as rigorous myself as I could and try to stay consistent, like with what sources I was using. And so, yeah.
This question here, for the mic, is that on?
It's on.
Okay. I was wondering about, you process so much information, and there's also this tendency for maybe the shift in the new normal. And how do you make sure, do you have this fear, or have you found yourself saying, 11 or 15 months ago, that would have not have been normal, but now you're saying, well, it is kind of normal maybe now. And how do you make sure you don't like shift that whole perception?
Yeah, and I have that conversation with myself all the time. Like this morning when Trump tweeted, cheating Obama, did you even notice that?
Yes.
There were like 100 other things after, so it's, and then, he picked on Hillary again over his other crooked Hillary. So I'm always in that loop of dialogue with myself, like don't normalize this. This still, even though it seems arduous and maybe picayune to be talking about his tweets, I still like remind myself that that is something that needs to be included. So career-wise, before I founded the New Agenda, I was a trader on Wall Street, so I am used to having huge amounts of information I need to decipher and kind of remember, and then like have things click a year later. So I have that kind of skill set that I did all those years, which has come in handy.
So I follow you both on Twitter. I'm over here. Sorry, this is the mic. I follow you both on Twitter, and I do rely on both of you for lots of great information. And I want to know, first of all, how do you sleep at night? I mean, you're a former ethics director, and you're seeing all these affronts to ethics. And Amy is cataloging all these what I consider it to be atrocities on our democracy. And I know I'm having trouble sleeping, so how do you sleep at night?
Not alone.
You know, I didn't sleep a lot when I was in the government. It really took a toll on me. And then the job change to such a different career was hard, on top of just the news gets worse all the time. And so I went through actually months of really serious insomnia. And I finally lately gotten to sleep, and I think I'm just tired. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I do sleep. What's his last name? Steve Lee. He's the creator of one of the Hollywood guys. Like, got me this beautiful bottle of bourbon, which I since have reordered for myself, and like one shot of that, and I'm good. But the thing that has impacted me, I have been so careful about my health and wanting to maintain my health, and I actually, no, it's not in the book, but it's in an interview I just did about, oh yeah, it is in the book. I, after the summer, had cracked a tooth, and it was just an old filling, and I went to my endodontist, and she was a small woman who grew up in India, and she said to me, "You're screaming in your sleep. This is what happens in dictatorships." And she said, "You have to get a mouth guard." And I did get a mouth guard, which to me was like a sign, because I really pride myself on my health, of giving up a part of myself. That I was grinding my teeth in my sleep, that he was like internalized in me. So as much and as strong as I wanted to be, yeah, it's had an impact. But I worked really hard at trying to keep myself healthy. This poor guy is in the corner, has been raising his hand.
You're bringing up some really good things, and you said two things that I think are interesting. First of all, I have no idea how you do this. Your energy level is out of control. And talking about you're going to do this until he goes. And I guess I just would love your opinion on this, because I grew up in Boston listening to GBH.
I'm from Boston too.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the whole Watergate thing with my mom and dad,
Yeah.
I didn't know much, but I knew that I loved Senator Inouye so much. I was called, McConnell Mitchell. So anyway, I have this cynical view right now that I call him the Wharf Four, Manafort, Junior, Kushner, and Flynn, that he pardons them, he gets in some sort of trouble money-wise, he gets frustrated because he's such an ego, he quits, Pence pardons him, and then we're talking about citizenship and census. Am I wrong to be so cynical?
Okay, so I have a view, this is my opinion, I don't believe he's going to make it through the end of his first term. And I view that there are, part of the reason he assumed control, and if you follow me on Twitter, week 67 was a night he went on Jeanine Pirro. I said, this is the beginning of the end. The fact that he's going on Janine's show, he knows something is, and that was a week he just totally shifted and became the boss of everything. But I see three parallel, and I know I live in this guy's head. It's scary. So I'm like, why would he go on her show on a Saturday night when she has low ratings? I see three ways to his end, and I'm not sure I have enough information to know which one it will be. One is the Me Too movement, and Stormy Daniels, or a potpourri of other women, and not necessarily the sexual misconduct, but the payments might come back to haunt him, or it might be the sexual misconduct. And that would be my favorite choice. The second is the Mueller probe, and any different age of gradation. The thing I feel like doesn't get enough coverage, that maybe it's just me as like a former Wall Streeter. The Deutsche Bank stuff drives me crazy. And I traded distressed debt, so I know all about Trump. He was like a frequent customer of ours. Nobody would be lending to him. So, months after Deutsche Bank is fined for being the global laundromat for Russian money, all of a sudden they're lending $300 million to Trump, and not in their real estate group. This was the same week you resigned, by the way. Not in their real estate group, but out of their private banking group, which if you work in banking is totally atypical, because the real estate group is the experts. The private banking group would never do that. And then they lent $285 million to Kushner a month before the election to refinance a property he had bought from a Russian oligarch, Leviev. So watch Deutsche Bank. And anyways, there's a whole potpourri within. And then the third area, which, you know, again, I'm going to keep going back to, and hopefully you'll pick up some information in the book, Cambridge Analytica. Like, you know, today there was something in the Washington Post that fake information could have moved 4 points of Obama voters away from Hillary. That was so well targeted. You had Cambridge Analytica sitting in the office with Parscale, as well as Facebook. You have ties between Cambridge Analytica and Russia. Like, this is a story yet to be told. So it could be that, one of those three. It's been a long night. Good.
Well, first I want to say it's deja vu all over again because I worked for a Post Newsweek TV station during Watergate. And I do digital media now. But my question is, so you're doing like real things that you see every day and you write those down. The story is Trump really never thought he would be president and was shocked. So he's up there doing all these crazy things, but there's all this stuff going on in the background that is not his bailiwick. So who's doing that? Is it Pence and the people behind Pence? Is it the Koch brothers? What's going on? Because Trump's too busy watching TV to dismantle the government.
Well, so I look at it, and Walter might have some thoughts on this too, but I look at it again, everything he does is either about making money or staying in power. And people have asked me, like, do you think he's in cahoots with the Mercers and the Kochs? And I say, they're like a Venn diagram. There might be areas they co-agree on, like tax cuts for the rich. And then the Koch brothers writing Paul Ryan a $500,000 check. But I think Trump is off on his own tangent. But in order to keep himself in power, if you look at it as the objective, he put in people, and this is in the book as well, who basically, if you look at their visitor log, it's all industry people and lobbyists. And they don't meet, like, for example, Pruitt with any environmentalists. So I sort of view it as a marriage of convenience, but I think his goal is to be an authoritarian leader of our country, and I think he's making remarkable progress on that front. If all these other people are deconstructing the government, and that helps him, then it works for the other people that are funding him as well. So there is like some overall rhyme to the reason, and so there's no checks and balances for him. Increasingly, our government looks like the Trump organization with Trump and 20 sycophants around him. Anybody who doesn't tell him, you know, as you said, exactly what he wants to hear is gone. But you might have some thoughts on that as well.
I think that having dealt firsthand with the people in the White House, it can be easy to overlook the effectiveness of some appointees out of the agency because of the clown car he's turned the White House into. I mean, he's got just unbelievably incompetent people there, with a few exceptions. But out of some of the agencies, they're more effective. Like Pruitt, for all he's running around creating all kinds of ethics problems, he's also been very effective at rolling back environmental regulation. And if that's your goal, then he's doing his job well in terms of the substantive thing. Or Don McGahn, I mentioned, even though he's in the White House and is just absolutely clueless about government, he has narrowly focused on stacking those courts, and he's really moved a high volume of nominees through. Now, some of it has looked like a crazy assembly line where they get a judge who's a nominee who's a Ghostbuster and one who doesn't know what a motion in limine is. But others didn't fall apart like that. And so I think, and there was this recent story this weekend about just how hapless their presidential personnel office is, having drinking and smoking parties.
Yeah.
I mean, that's unbelievable, because in past administrations, that was some of the most impressive characters.
And that didn't even get covered. I mean, that's 3 items in the list last week, if you missed that story in the Washington Post there.
To me, that story...
And didn't get covered at all.
Yeah. And that story blew me away more than anything else I think I've read in 6 months. But I have to qualify that by saying that's just because I'm personally close to it, because I worked with past PPOs. And
that's the people that vet the incoming administration.
Yeah, and recruit them, like in the first place, go out and pick them. So there's a lot of bumbling incompetence that's just unbelievably shocking, but there are these little exceptions to the rule where there are people who are achieving agendas, but they're not driven by the president.
They're deconstructing their agencies.
Yeah.
They basically are.
She has the mic, but I will come over here. Yeah, she has the mic.
I have not been sleeping about Sinclair for a long, long time. I would like you to address this because I really can't get to sleep anymore because I think that I'm worried about the next election and Sinclair is bothering me an awful lot. Thank
Okay,
you.
first of all, we all have to take care of ourselves and sleep. So you have to like give yourself permission, everybody here, to take,
I'm a therapist, I know that, but I'm telling you, there are problems.
So I view, and I spoke about this last night with Chris Hayes, who doesn't believe Trump is actually trying to silence dissent. And I was like, what?
Chris Hayes?
Yes, I was on bed last night. It was just kind of shocking. But I see it in the context of Sinclair as one of many things he has done to change the media landscape. So Sinclair was the first act from the new FCC chair to increase the, that you could reach now 72% of households, and rolling back a law from the 1970s in order to do it. And then you'll see a lot of items in the list, like having Boris Epstein 9 times a week, having to use the word fake news in your coverage. Finally, the media's covered it. So that's one item. Let's not forget that Time Inc. and Trump's obsession with time, there were several billionaires that made a run at them, is now owned by the Koch brothers. Let's not forget that Trump's, in the early weeks, he has this thing with CNN. He culled them from the herd early on. He's been constantly attacking them. He's been threatening them. His son-in-law have threatened CNN. Then he holds up the merger of AT&T and Time Warner. And by the way, Rupert Murdoch has gone to AT&T and said, we'll buy CNN twice. And then there's the media outlets that have just gone out of existence. There is a billionaire, Rickards, who does fundraising for Trump, who bought the 2 of the largest websites in New York, Gothamness and DNA Info, and basically shut them down. And then the LA Weekly, which was the second largest newspaper in LA, was purchased by an unknown buyer and shut down. So the landscape of our media, and Chris's argument back as well, the media that we're following is more followers than ever. That might be true, but the local media, the disappearing media, the changing hands of the media is happening at an alarming rate.
And this is happening at a time when budgets for investigative journalism are down because the internet's driving newspapers out of business. I mean, remember, if you live in this town, every day the Washington Post was like this thick, and now it looks like a newsletter compared to what it used to be.
Absolutely. First off, I want to thank both of you for your important and wonderful work. It's so very important. But we've been talking about the future, and because you study Trump and his circle so closely, it looks like the way everything is trending, it's going to be a very progressive wave in November.
Yes.
Faced with the future of 12 or 16 congressional committees investigating him, is there a chance that the president, under some sort of pretext, either manufactured or otherwise, might suspend the November elections?
Or there might be interference with the elections. I would count on there being interference with the elections, which is why we need to all get out and vote and get everybody we know to vote. There was a hearing last week or the week before with his new DHS Nielsen, and she was asked about, from the Senate committee, what they have done since 2016 with the states that were hacked or had attempted hacks. And I think the number was 5 out of 150 state officials who requested information had been given clearance where they could get the information. So basically they're doing nothing to change things, and guess what? Putin is visiting the United States next week, or shortly. So the chances that Russia, and others, I mean, they're clearly still involved on Twitter and social media, is going to attempt to interfere is pretty great. So I think we all have to make sure we all get to the elections. Is anything possible? Yes, because every time I scream in my head, oh my God, he fired Comey, that's the end of him. Then it's the next day, and then he does like something more outrageous, like fired Sally Yates, so that's the end of him. Yeah. I think we all have to, it's an important juncture that election happens and that we show up. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hi.
Question about Trump. what is it, what do you see the meaning, and when Trump just has bizarre moments, like yesterday at the egg roll, where he couldn't remember the name of the White House, and then said it didn't have a name.
And he was talking to the kids about the budget for Hillary. Oh my God. Yeah, like you can't make this stuff up. I sort of feel like he is, and this is, I feel like he has a storm in his head. He wakes up in the morning with a storm in his head and he has to release it some way. Either it's starting to text or whatever it is. He's like a man that's, has a storm, and that's become like the feeling of our country. I think he's just, I only took Psych 101. I wish I had taken law school and more psychology courses, but clearly he's not, he's trying to take over control of our country. And he just doesn't, like, there's no accountability for any of that. He can misspell things, he can call Obama cheating Obama, and he'll, who knows what he'll be doing tomorrow morning. There's no consequences. He's just being himself, he's being authentic. So he just continues. It's not going to stop. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. In addition to everything that's in this book, which is a lot, and I understand it's overwhelming, I'm sure everybody here has also experienced changes and things that are not normal in their personal lives as well. And I think especially given what Cambridge Analytica has done, and we've seen our people, our family members, and the people we love change. And I was wondering if you think there's also a value in documenting the not normal in our personal lives, things like we can't sleep and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty widespread. I think our country is, yeah. And then I think whatever makes you feel good about, like if you feel good writing, keeping a diary, I think you should do it. Because you'll look back, I mean, my kids like roll their eyes, they're like, if we have to hear one more time, we're living through history. But you won't believe, like, when you reread this in 5 years, you're not going to believe what you were experiencing. So I tried, and once I decided to do the book, Lost That Battle, to keep a journal. Right. Because you're not going to believe it. I think we all should be, keeping a journal.
One thing that really has struck me is I feel like I have a new appreciation when you read history books for the idea that the people in those books didn't know what was going to happen next. Yes. And I feel like there was a lot of times I read history books viewing it through the lens of what happened next, and it's easy to forget the uncertainty they felt, and you kind of know it consciously, but you don't really feel it. And in some ways I found comfort in that, because all of these people didn't know what was going to happen next, and so just as we don't know what's going to happen next, they didn't either, and people have been there before. And I try to stay away from making predictions about the future, because I think I've also gotten a new appreciation of randomness. And I think, to your question, Trump's a very undisciplined individual. I'm not sure he's ever actually held a job. And so the idea of having to go to work every day, I mean, I'm only half kidding, because you see sometimes kids come right out of college and the first thing they have to learn is the work environment, like showing up every day and not sleeping at your desk and not wandering off or quitting early. And he's learning that at 70 instead of at 22. So it's going to produce erratic, strange behaviors.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that, my daughter was studying abroad in Amsterdam, so I went over there for Thanksgiving and visiting Anne Frank's house and their Resistance Museum. We are so far, the good news is we are so far ahead. Like for years, when Hitler was in the rise, using the Netherlands, for example, it was only like the student activists in the early years that did anything. Everyone else said this was going to be okay. And the stuff happening was the same kind of stuff, the silencing of the press, attacking, in that case it was the Jews, and in our case it might be the immigrants and the Muslims first, although the anti-Semitism is up as well. But many of the same patterns, it's all sort of consistent, but they went for years, and it wasn't until they started dragging their men off to go fight the war that they realized, oh, something is wrong here. So our country, we have from the get-go, over, what is it, 4 million women and men marched in the first march, and over 1 million the second time, and now our teens are protesting. So our country is not going quietly, which is the good news.
I also want to thank you both for your work, and Walter, I miss you, and AGE. I work in the government, and so not having you there as a voice is missed. But it's heartening for me to be here tonight because I'm among people who watch what's going on and see the changes and are documenting it and are sticking with both of you watching what's going on. But what's a little bit disturbing on a daily basis is watching the lack of effect of what we're documenting across the country. Yeah. And I don't always have the broadest view and the time to look at it, but I'd like to know from both of you what you're seeing as broader patterns across the country that are really breaking through, because I see a lot of people go, that's just him. I stick with him no matter what. The mounting evidence doesn't seem to be breaking through, and I'd like to know what you're seeing because you're watching it much closer.
I'm having a first-hand exposure to that doing this book tour. And with people who feel like they need to be playing the devil's advocate and saying, he's just out of the box, he's just different. And it's like gaslighting. It's literally like gaslighting. And I think you just have to give it a name and keep doing what you're doing, because there's more of people that are upset and activated than people that are not. And that's the thing you need to remember. Those people are... and I run a national women's organization, so I've been an observer for the last decade of different ways people are treated. And I also noticed, because I'm the messenger for a historical document, the nature of the questions I get asked. It's sort of like, oh, maybe you're being, I know what the underlying, what they're saying, hysterical. And so there's a lot of that still floating around, and largely the early wave of resistance has been, not entirely, but percentage-wise more women. And I just say carry on, because the one thing I have seen shift is more and more people get it. Like, it's moving in our direction. And we're never going to get, there are some people that just want to like tune it out, go for it. We're on the right side of history. And there's a lot more people that get what's happening than want to just say it's okay.
I think another thing that's good is you've got different people trying different approaches. And so, if one key doesn't work, well, somebody else is trying something else. And then in the good government groups, communities with the nonprofits, I've noticed each has its own distinctive flavor. And I don't see a lot of competition between them or resentment of the different approaches. Instead, we all feel like we're fighting for democracy. Some are more partisan, some are less partisan. Some work more with grassroots, some work sort of the legal things. For me, I'm focusing on that area in the center where you might find common ground, which is different than I think people who are going to get the masses out. And believe me, if Mueller gets fired or elections get suspended, they're the ones we need to get us all out there to just fill the streets and refuse to leave until it gets fixed. But in the meantime, I think a lot about the fact that I'm not trying to be for or against either party. What I'm trying to do is, I'm scared of the stuff that Amy's talking about. And so for me, the people that interest me are kind of the people in the center who maybe think differently than I do about certain political issues, but are horrified by what's going on and are putting country before party, and they're right now a thin, soft voice that you can barely hear. But they exist, and I'm trying to connect with them and focus on that rather than focusing on policy issues, because right now I'm more concerned with the structure of democracy than other policy issues. So I stay out of things like the environment or other things because I'm focused on democracy right now. And I think there's some room in the middle where the left and the right's moderates can connect. But I also think there's a value in people taking different approaches. And so I just think everybody kind of has to tap into their own skill set and focus on the things that they think are going to help protect democracy in this period of assault. Democracy and our institutions are under assault.
and I hope the book, because I keep pointing this out to people who question it, this is like 400 pages with 100 pages of footnotes of actual reported things that happen. This is not my opinion. None of these are Amy thinks, and people in some ways yell at me like, why didn't you write it this way? What people are saying he did this because this is just dry facts. And this might be the first rationale that we have to, like, people are sending it to their cousins that voted for Trump. There are people that are conservative that are buying this book to say, this is the facts of what's happening to our country. It's indisputable, it's right here, and look at it. So I'm hoping that gets you
Even though we're past time, we're going to take 2 last quick questions. I did have this sir waiting for a bit, and then this.
I'll ask you at the end.
Yeah,
She's been waiting all the time.
Oh,
she can ask me at the end.
Okay.
Go ahead.
What concerns me is that the end of Trump may not be the end of Trumpism. In a way, I think that Pence could be worse because he's competent and wouldn't make the mistake of being a buffoon.
Yep.
Would you consider continuing your work after Trump is
No,
dead?
no. Trump is, listen, and I get this question 100 times. Pence is a Republican. I might not agree with him. I'm gay. What's the joke that Trump made? That he wants to hang all you people? So I don't agree with him anything in policy. But he's a Republican. He's not an authoritarian. I'm not saying he's better or worse, but if he ends up being the person that takes Trump's place, who knows how it's all going to play out. I don't think you can lose sleep about it. But he would not be trying to do things the way Trump is. Trump is like totally different. I think we have to, focus on taking back our democracy and worry about that next. I'm not saying Pence would be better or worse. I'm just saying he's a Republican. He's like a Jeb Bush or whatever. Yeah, like my son got into the car a month after the election and said, I miss Jeb Bush. I miss George Bush at this point. I miss Reagan. He's a Republican. And there would be checks and balances. Our government would function. So, yeah, that's a question a lot. And it's not a luxury we have to think about. At this point, we have to focus on taking back our democracy, in my opinion.
He might be less likely to start a war with North Korea.
Because he's in a bad mood.
He
might actually have a State Department. Yeah. Hi, Eric.
Hello. I too want to thank both of you for everything that you're doing, and I'm heartened to be in a room of like-minded people as well, and I think that that's helpful that we surround ourselves with people who feel the same way. The topic came up a little bit tonight, and I just wanted to ask a little bit further. What can the media do better? What can the media do to cover this regime, as you say? And I agree with that description. What can the media do? And I'll just use as an example the press briefings, which totally infuriate me, and I cannot watch them. To me, those are totally, it's propaganda. It's totally useless, and it seems like the legitimate media, anyway, don't really seem to push back on all the lying that's being done. So I guess my sort of general question is, what can legitimate media do to cover this better? Thank you.
Yeah, I try not to beat up on the media because they're getting beat up, enough. And I think that their job is to cover the news stories, and so he distracts them. And again, it's the 80-20 thing where they're covering a small portion of the news. Bonnie Urbay interviewed me today. She's a PBS journalist, for those of you who don't know her, an old-time journalist. And she's eager to start to cover him in a way that would differentiate and actually call out some of the acts. But none of our mainstream media has gotten to that point yet. So I think the best we can hope for is that they investigate, and we have to support them financially so they can stay in business. They investigate a lot of the stuff, a lot of the news stories breaking, they're breaking. So the investigative journalism is incredibly important, but I sort of view my role as, and a lot of them secretly, in addition to sending me their stories because they want to include it in the list, they tell me they read my list because they too miss so many things because they're covering the same stories. So I don't know what the fix is, other than it's hard to, some of them are terrible. Like like the New York Times drives me freaking nuts. They go through their phases. Like, I don't understand how the Washington Post and the New York Times can both do the same thing, but the New York Times can make me so outraged all the time by having to give a voice to, let's interview a white supremacist, and some of it is just ridiculous. But anyway, no.
Yeah, I think one thing that's been good to see is I feel like the press has gotten its game up in response to this. I was feeling a little bit in 2016 like they were trying so hard to provide equal coverage. They'd be like, oh, this person jaywalked and this person colluded with Russia. We're going to spend 15 minutes on each or something, and that bothered me. But I feel like since then they've really gotten their game up. There have been mistakes. Sometimes they're a little slow to admit them, but I give them credit for that because they're under a lot of fire right now of people labeling them fake news and attacking them, and that's going to put anybody's back up against the wall. Sort of along the lines of what Amy said, the only thing that drives me nuts is there do seem to be a handful in print media who've gotten really good access to the White House, but in my view they've gotten it by being willing to trade puff pieces for access. And there was a Kellyanne Conway piece that came out talking about her as this feisty person and anybody who criticized her must just be sexist. And then the next day, the special counsel's office, not Mueller, the Office of Special Counsel, came out with the finding that she had violated the Hatch Act twice. Well, she knew the day it was going to come out. That kind of choreographing happens internally. And so she coordinated with these reporters to run this puff piece on her the day before she gets labeled, and so that people have good feelings about her. Or the way the news story about Cohen paying the porn star out of his own pocket, supposedly. I still don't believe that, but the New York Times story reported it as uncritically as fact.
Yes.
And a couple other sources.
So defensive about that.
Boy, the writer of that story went berserk when I questioned it. I wasn't even writing to her. I was writing to somebody. I wound up having to block her because she kept coming after me. Leave me alone. So that, I think that's the one category that bothers me. But overall, I feel like the press has been doing an amazing job. And as the director of OGE, even before then, when we meet with foreign delegations coming to study our ethics program, I'd always say to them, you can't have an ethics program without free press, which the Chinese loved when I said that. They say sarcastically.
One more, I guess.
Well, is it going to be really quick?
Yes.
All right. The final question. No,
in all of this, a lot of it is Trump directly, but are you picking up trends with Republicans in Congress? And I think about the comments that were made about Rohrabacher and his relationship with Russians, but what's going on there? Are you picking something up?
Yeah, the thing that, like, you know, again, it's like, question mark, why is this happening? All these Republicans who were chairs of committees who are not running again. And Chaffetz, your friend, who was going to investigate you, was the most interesting. Like, all of a sudden, he just disappears and goes to work for Fox News.
I'd
Like,
like to know the true story.
oh boy, you know, he said he had a bonus. Like, what? But then, and then there's been a slew of after, including now Gowdy, of all of them. Trey Gowdy, 4 times has been going after Trump. So there's like weird dynamics within the Republic, but a lot of them are not running, which I sort of view as the weak person's way of leaving. Like, they know that they're like dogs with their tails between their legs. They know that they've done wrong and they're just trying to leave town so history won't judge them the way history will judge them. And then there's characters like Grassley and Graham who make such dramatic shifts as characters in my book that I really wonder how Graham went from being alongside McCain in fighting for our country to having the first criminal referral from his committee be against Christopher Steele. Like, how did we close that circle? So that's like question mark. You know, and then there'll be like these random stories again in a weekly list. The Dallas Morning News reporting on all the contributions from Russia to those very people and naming them by name. And then it's Monday and we've forgotten about that story. So that's in the list too. So a lot of loose ends to be closed.
all right, so now, thank you for books. There's plenty of copies behind the register, and I will set up a quick table, and everybody will line up this way.